Hi, this is Jeff Nyquist, and this is another edition of Friends and Enemies. I'm in the United States, and my co-host Alex Benesch is in Germany. And we're going to be talking about the Cold War. This is part three. We're going to be talking about the Sino-Soviet split, and of course, how the defector Golitsyn came to the West with information about that split being a fraud. Um, so I should just give a little bit of background, but Alex, did you want to make any comments about this whole idea of fake splits within the communist movement?
Just real quick, I mean, when you look at the whole context and where communism stood at the time, it should become clear that staging this split and some other splits in the communist realm, North Korea and other places, staging these splits was something they were absolutely going to do. I mean, this was sort of like the logical step to take. So when defectors started to talk about this and other were debating this, in the CIA and elsewhere, this was not some fringe scenario they were discussing, some unlikely thing that may be true or not. This was probably the most significant scenario of them all, because, and I just want to real quick give the main reason for it, because socialism didn't work, and they knew that in the 1920s. It was not productive. It could never compete with the West, let alone outdo the West. So if the West was using an offset strategy, just producing more and more and living better, what were the communists going to do? Early on, they knew socialism didn't really work. So what's the only play there? Or what's the logical play? You stage splits to ease the pressure on communist countries, pressure by the West. You stage splits, and you also prepare for the public end of communism at some stage, because it doesn't work, and ultimately you have to ditch communism publicly in order to rebuild and in order to be able to talk and communicate with all kinds of groups worldwide. So this is when you can finally talk to the conservatives and the audiences, the regular people worldwide. It's not just you can talk to commies worldwide, but to everybody. So,
well, the thing is, I think that that you have the question of the ultimate nature and true philosophy of communism in its distilled form. Communism is it's a kind of mental disorder. It's a kind of alienation from reality, from the political and social world. And I must remind you that Marx said that communism wouldn't work until the free market was smashed all over the world. So, and somehow magically, when you smash the free market everywhere in the world, you break the spell of greed that drives the motor of capitalism, and suddenly everybody will want to cooperate, and you'll have the possibility of socialism. Now, to what extent people believe this magic transformation will happen, I don't think that the practical politicians running Russia or China believe it, but this is their movement. Communism is the banner under which they control everything. And if you look around the world, Russia, China, North Korea, Cuba, they're all working together, and they're not really helping any genuine capitalist country. Even Iran is part of their mix and is not really a capitalist country. So I think we have to realize that the devil does really believe in evil. They really do believe in something. And it may not be what we think it is, because communism isn't an economic system. That's really not what it is. It's more of a spiritual rebellion against the existing order. And this is why when you go back to the Soviet Union in the 20s, to Willy Munzenberg and then to Gramsci and these other people, and you go to the way that Marxist-Leninists were taught when I was in graduate school, when they were trying to bring people into the underground, They told people, don't read Das Kapital, don't worry about that. That's where Marx's economic stuff is. Read the early Marx. So there was a de-emphasizing among communists of this economic communist theory. That wasn't the important part. It was all about the superstructure. It was all about, well, controlling or destroying religion and creating this new, because they were going to guide humankind. So it's a
it was
it's a morphing kind of thing. But
it's like
so
it was to me, just to quickly interject. I mean, it was a cult movement shaped and optimized to get peasants to fight, especially in Russia, to tell them, we have a better future for you. You can become sort of self-governing, with other farmers, and we're, this is the better future. You sign here. This is a military contract for the Red Army. Sign here. We're going to get you a gun and ammunition and some training, and then you can kill, the people from the old system. That's what it was for. That's what it was built to do, because economically, Marx and the others that said they all said the same thing, basically. They just criticized capitalism, or they just criticized the old serfdom. They just criticized what the rest of the world was, but they never came up with a true economic system. They didn't know how to make one. All they did was say, we will not determine the prices of goods and labor by a calculation of, supply and demand. We're going to calculate this, with a method that's for the common good. So if one factory worker is a metal worker and he presses parts, how much is this metal worker entitled to another? How much is he entitled to another product made by another person in another factory? They didn't know. So it was never an economic system and to make everybody happy. It was a movement designed to get people angry and to start shooting.
And in the 1920s, they abandoned any attempt to control the economy. They just wanted to control the major industries, and they let the farmers have their land, and they allowed a free market in grain. It was at the end of the 1920s when Stalin first tried the experiment of collectivized farming in Siberia, that what they learned from that experiment in Siberia, they carried on to the rest of Russia and to Ukraine. And that's when the Ukraine terror famine happened, because the Ukrainian farmers didn't want to give over their land or their animals. In fact, a lot of animals in Russia were slaughtered, and they ate them because they didn't want the state to get them. So that was a disaster for Soviet agriculture. But all that being said, all this business about that, getting back to the split thing, the communists realized after Stalin, and this is Golitsyn's analysis, is that Stalin had, by being very strict and wanting to control all the communist parties in the world and decide who was going to be in charge of them, he had alienated some of the communists, and the communist movement was a bit in disarray from Stalin's behavior. And Khrushchev and his associates after Stalin wanted to fix this. And of course, they began on this program of what later became sort of denouncing Stalin. In 1956, Khrushchev denounced Stalin and went to heal the wounds. And one of the things Stalin did in the communist movement was he had a big disagreement with Tito, the communist dictator of Yugoslavia. Tito had fought Hitler. He'd had a big guerrilla movement. The communist agents had gotten the British to support him more than the non-communist guerrilla fighters that were fighting in the former Yugoslavia against the Nazis. And so the communists and the Red Army reached Yugoslavia first. And of course, they had a regime there. But what happened was that Stalin was unhappy with Tito. Tito was not obeying everything Stalin told him. And so Stalin sent assassins to kill Tito, but Tito survived. Tito sent a man to see Stalin with a note saying, well, I got this close to you, we could have killed you, but we want to make you understand, if you try to kill Tito, it's a two-way street. So that was when Stalin just left Tito alone at that point. And of course, this was the Stalin-Tito split. And what really surprised the people in Moscow was here's a communist country that broke from Moscow, and the West was eager to show friendship to Tito, to help Tito with economically, to help him even with military items. And so they were stunned. Oh my gosh, you mean if a communist country has a split with Moscow, the West will rush in and help them and build them up? So this was really interesting. So that they decided when Khrushchev came in, there was some kind of patching up. And Golitsyn, in his book New Lies for Old, talks about the evidence that there was a healing of the rift under Khrushchev, because it was really a personality disagreement between Stalin and Tito. And Khrushchev went around trying to heal all these things, because Khrushchev didn't like the way Stalin executed other communists, the way Stalin treated other communists.
The secret speech, right?
Yeah, it wasn't the not so secret speech, because it got out. I believe it got out through the Mossad or Israeli agents, if I'm remembering right. And then it got everybody had a copy of this speech, right? And it was Stalin was blaming. I mean, Khrushchev was blaming Stalin for all kinds of economic problems in the USSR.
And they looked into Stalin's past, correct? They had a commission and they researched into Stalin's early history and his shenanigans, right?
Well, I think they dug up this old letter that that Stalin's widow, Lenin's widow, had written that denounced Stalin and said that Stalin was a rude person. Which I think it was actually, there was an old letter from Lenin about Stalin had used bad words and basically cursed out Lenin's wife when Lenin was basically a vegetable from having multiple strokes.
And so, something about Stalin's alleged underage girlfriend, in his early days. I mean, they dug up stuff and they just tried to create this appearance of a break with Stalin.
But of course, and one defector noted, I forget if it was Peter Deryabin, noted that the statement behind the scenes that Khrushchev had made is that, people said, why are we blaming Stalin? And he said, because Stalin's broad shoulders can carry the blame.
Yeah.
And so it was by the way, this is a technique of Chinese civilization. Whenever the old emperor dies, the new emperor puts all the reasons for things being difficult in the empire on the dead emperor.
Yeah, and also something I really want to emphasize and underline here, because we recently done a show on the Korean War, right? And we've also talked about the Chinese Revolution, and the nationalists losing because they were abandoned and so on and so forth. So people need to imagine what the rest of the world was thinking about all of this. First, the big shock. China, this giant country with all these citizens, this country became communist. This was a huge shock to people worldwide. Then came the Korean, then you had the Korean War. This was a war of pretty serious proportions where, the United States and partners, they were fighting not just the Koreans, but also the Chinese. They surprised everybody. We got 300,000 soldiers, crossing these bridges and so on. And also everybody knew that the equipment of the Koreans and the equipment of the Chinese was really Russian or Soviet. So putting all of this together created the impression worldwide of a massive communist united threat. So obviously, especially over the 60s, that decade, obviously they would have to try to lessen the pressure against them. Lessen the just make the international outrage smaller, and the only way really to do that was to stage these phony hostilities. Phony hostilities between Russia and China, and also to some degree these animosities between North Korea and
And
Mao
between
and
Albania
Stalin.
and the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
between Romania and the Soviet Union, between China and Vietnam, and Vietnam and Cambodia, and so forth. Now, some of these disputes are real, others are exaggerated or are quickly healed, but some are outright just fabrications.
Yeah.
And this is the point. Golitsyn makes detailed arguments about the Yugoslav Soviet split, the Albanian split, and the Sino-Soviet split in his book New Lies for Old. And I direct people who want to look at those arguments to read them. They're carefully studied. There's footnotes. This is just not out of the blue. And then there's a book that Nevin Gusak, my friend Nevin Gusak, made, which you can get on Amazon. Its title is Golitsyn Vindicated, and this is just massive footnotes. I mean, he has so many sources in here about how these splits were not what they appeared to be, showing collaboration behind the scenes between the Russians and the Chinese after their split, and between the Albanians and the Soviets, the Romanians and the Soviets, and so on. Yeah. And we'll see how this doesn't work when it comes to even the rhetoric is inconsistent about the split, because one of the things Khrushchev, if you read Khrushchev on his split with Tito, remember Golitsyn says he's going back and he's healing the rift with Tito. In fact, Stalin, shortly before Khrushchev was deposed, he visited Yugoslavia. They had a big meeting. And in fact, Nikolai Mironov, the KGB general, died in a plane crash going there. But what's interesting is that Khrushchev's rhetoric was to denounce Tito as a revisionist, someone who wasn't a true Marxist. And this is what the Albanians did versus the Soviets. This is what the Chinese did versus the Soviets, calling them revisionists. There's a book here I have. This is typical of the Chinese propaganda. And why did they put this out in English? I don't know. But it's the Soviet Union under the new Tsars. And this is a massive denunciation. This book was, of course, published in foreign language press Peking, when we said Peking rather than Beijing. And of course, this is printed in the People's Republic of China in 1978. Right after the criminals, about the time that right after Mao's death, and the Gang of Five were all strung up. But it says in here, the Bolshevik Party founded by Lenin has degenerated into an out-and-out revisionist and fascist party. And of course, this is the very funny thing, because this is the same rhetoric that the Soviet Union used against Tito in Yugoslavia. Yeah. It's almost identical. And it just, when you read it, it doesn't really make much sense, because, and here's why. Here you have Stalin. They use the fact that Stalin was denounced by Khrushchev for Mao to then say that Khrushchev is a revisionist. Mm-hmm. But Mao was somebody who had been mistreated by Stalin, who wasn't always very happy about what Stalin was doing. So it really didn't make sense, in that China was getting more respect, more tolerance. Stalin never went to Beijing. Khrushchev went to Beijing, but Stalin never went there. Yeah, so what is this about, right?
Yeah, but this forced collectivization in China was clearly modeled after the program from Soviet Russia, the earlier program.
Oh, more than that. It was Soviet advisors. Soviet advisors.
So many advisors. And so many advisors, and all the important Chinese people were trained by the Soviets and the Russians, and the Russians paid for this whole thing. And there was the Soviet news agency was then all over China, and Soviet portraits, and it was just such a big deal. And so I always say that, it's hard to find anybody more Stalinist than Mao, even though they pretended to not really respect each other that much, and
Mao
trying to humiliate them.
Mao was a revisionist in the sense that his people are accusing the Soviet Union of being revisionist. Now, this, of course, book came out when Deng Xiaoping was just coming to power. So Deng Xiaoping was denounced as a revisionist by Mao. So it really is very strange. The whole thing doesn't really cohere if you look at all the changes in China and in Russia. It doesn't fully cohere because what you have is you have Deng Xiaoping wanting to have more capitalism, and he's coming to power in this year 1978 in China, and you have Khrushchev, who is himself going back on. They're all doing it. So for them to, and of course they're doing it, why? To make the communist movement more flexible and more effective.
And also
overseas.
And people need to remember this. Now, for example, in communist Germany, the communist German state, the Communist Party was even allowed there, or even advised or ordered to maintain at least some nationalist veneer, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Many people may not know this, but they kept some of the old style uniforms, or they kept talking in friendly terms about the legacy of Bismarck and some Prussian stuff. So this was deliberate, because you were talking about an ideology that was cooked up by some French people and some bearded weirdos from Germany. Then it made its way into Russia, and then it was re-imported back into Germany. So of course you needed and wanted some veneer of nationalist elements in there. And we know that Stalin introduced or reintroduced some nationalist elements.
Lenin had always allowed for, the whole idea that Stalin and Lenin had allowed that you had to say that that in Russia it was Marxism, Leninism, or communism with Russian characteristics. And Mao was famously said, this is communism with Chinese characteristics. So you had to retain some nationalist element in the communism to get it to be accepted culturally in the country.
Exactly. Right? And like with the Chinese, I mean, you had this very, very old civilization in China going back to the Han Empire, which was, as significant as the Roman Empire, right? And so you couldn't just overnight introduce or force people into this communist ideology based on some weirdo German guy named Karl Marx. I mean, there was some German activity in China, of course, before, and some French activity, the so-called concessions and all these European powers try to get into China. But still, some weird German guy came up with this, and now this is supposed to be the thing for China, and like, what? So it had to be...
you had all these Chinese communists who were educated in Paris, like Zhou Enlai.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And Ho Chi Minh, who wasn't Chinese, was educated there too. So you had these characters that had these. I mean, after all, European influence on Japan and China, even though China was more insular and tended to reject the European influence, Marxism, especially, and Marxism-Leninism was kind of a rejection of the West from people who were from the West, right?
Yeah.
So it kind of fit.
And the astounding thing about North Korea to me is that it was allowed to have and develop a hereditary dynasty in North Korea. Kim Il Sung, Kim Jong Il, Kim Jong Un. I mean, this was pretty much unheard of, among communist circles for a very long time, to have like this hereditary, almost like communist kingdom. And this was also deliberately allowed, because they also wanted to have like a distance to North Korea. And I think that this is now an even bigger problem, because North Korea is like a joker card, because Moscow is probably pulling the strings still, and China is pulling the strings of North Korea, but they can launch an attack by North Korea against Japanese targets, South Korean targets, the U.S. base in Guam. Launch this, have North Korea initiate these attacks, and then the Russians and the Chinese could say, that wasn't us. You're having a problem with North Korea. We're not responsible for this. And they created this impression of a hereditary communist kingdom, and they made an effort in North Korea to seem particularly crazy and extrovert and weird. So it sells this fake split even more.
The Kim Jong-un's grandfather was a Soviet military officer who was sent by Stalin to take command of North Korea.
Oh, and by the way, did you see that in I think it was Annie Jacobson's book on CIA covert operations? This was like years ago, and she was quoting from older CIA reports that thought that Kim Il-sung, the first new communist dictator in North Korea, that Kim Il-sung was not Kim Il-sung. The real Kim was this rebel, a successful rebel guy that had a good reputation, a good one among the rebels. But then somehow the Russians decided to recruit some guy and then claim that this guy was really Kim. That's just on a side note, because some people, even communists or former Soviet sources, said something along those lines that the fake Kim was created from scratch. So this is like
there was a South Korean expert on North Korea. She had been the scholar, the only scholar outside of North Korea that had personally interviewed hundreds, I think it was dozens or hundreds of North Korean officials. She somehow got permission as a social scientist to do this. And I met her at a 2-day conference on North Korea at the George Bush Center in 2001. And, people were just rejecting what she was saying. But she, and I came up to her and I said, I don't understand why they don't accept what you're saying. Because what she was saying was that in North Korea, they are so deluded that they don't have the same reality that we do. They believe the communist propaganda in North Korea. That's part of the success of its insularity, that they're not connected to the internet, that they don't get to read our newspapers. They actually can put over this alternate reality. She said they really do believe in it. And she said, you have to understand, this is what she told me. Kim Il-sung, after the Korean War, you know what he did with his time? This leader of North Korea, he spent every day, he would have breakfast, lunch, and dinner at the homes of people and have his picture taken with ordinary people. And he tried to do it with every family in the country. And he lived a long time. So the 50s, 60s, 70s, he's going and visiting all these families. So you just count the days of the week. If he's visiting 3 families a day, he's visiting 1,000 families. And a family could be, 8 people, depending on how they live. So he's visiting 8,000 people a year and having his picture taken with their kids and them. And so by the time you get 10 years, that is 80,000 people, 240. Pretty soon you're getting close to 1 million people by the time he's dead that they have in their family photos the dear leader. Right?
Yep.
And so you have to understand how that makes people feel connected because they had a meal. They spent a day or some part of a day with this guy.
Yeah, Hitler kissing babies and stuff like that. Yeah. And it's like when the North Koreans, the leadership of North Korea, they came up with their own supposed brand of communism. They called it Yushe or Yuhe.
Yes.
I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that correctly. And so there wasn't really a new idea. They just kind of talked about this is our brand and we're still brothers, comrades with the other communist states, but we're kind of doing our own thing. And then there was a speech from 1967, and that's when Kim was laying it on very thick. It was almost exaggerating too much. He's overselling this thing. He said the following. First, the government of the Republic will implement with all consistency the line of independence, self-sufficiency, and self-defense to consolidate the political independence, again, independence of the country, build up more solidly the foundations of an independent national economy capable of ensuring the complete unification, independence, and prosperity of our nation, and increasing the country's defense capabilities so as to safeguard the security of the fatherland, blah, 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 reliably by our own force, by splendidly embodying our party's idea of Juche in all fields. So he's overusing the word independence. So we want independence because of independence, so we can have our independence. I mean, he's overselling it, right?
Yeah, and of course, this goes to what Ceausescu's regime in Romania did. And in fact, there's a book by the Romanian defector Ian Pacepa called Red Horizons, and you can order this on Amazon. And this is about Operation Red Horizon. Pacepa was the acting head of the Romanian intelligence service, and he saw this firsthand. And what Red Horizon was an operation to establish the idea that Ceausescu was independent of Moscow. And this ends up playing into how the Sino-Soviet split develops. Because some of the meetings, as the relationship developed in the 1970s between China and the United States, were facilitated by Ceausescu. Nixon had meetings with him, and they actually would go to Romania and set up things with the Chinese. But maybe I should get into the actual story of the Sino-Soviet split.
Well, hang on a sec. Yeah. Maybe before you start, I wanted to say something really quick. Because when you analyze this, of course you have to get into all of the relevant literature by the defectors, the Soviet defectors.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but and others,
yeah. But of course, this has to be further investigated using all other sources that are available to you, and this has to be investigated. Yep. And people need to understand. People who are not familiar yet with the defector literature, or maybe just familiar with some of it, people have to understand these defectors were all different, and some of these people, they had access to, different information, and some of that information that they had access to, some of that information may have been part of the deceptions of this. Mentioning one example, Jan Šejna from the Czechs, right?
Yes.
Because if you read Jan Šejna's books, he just relates what he heard, right?
Yes.
So he says that our guy, Czech guy, our liaison with the Soviets, he was visiting the Soviets and he was talking to this Russian guy, and this Russian guy said, "Man, we hate the Chinese, and we also heard from reliable sources that the Chinese hate us." So then, this Czech liaison guy talks to Jan Šejna and says, "Well, this is what I heard." So Jan Šejna relates this in his book, and that's why when you read Jan Šejna's book, there's some doubt about the split. There's some doubt, but he's still saying a lot of things that
because
indicate a split.
Because to make the split credible, they have to spread the rumor within and not
because
there's
it would
a
leak.
Need to know. Yeah, it would leak.
Yeah,
you have this is a very closely guarded secret. And of course, Golitsyn talks about how closely guarded the secret was within the inner KGB, which is only a set of counterintelligence officials in Moscow and in Beijing. Even Ian Pacepa, in his book Red Horizons is all about a kind of fake independence or split between Bucharest and Moscow. And of course, he explains it's all a fake operation done in coordination on the orders from Moscow. But yet he doesn't believe the Golitsyn or that the split between China and Russia is fake, right? Yeah. So you have the same thing with Šejna, and Šejna wrote articles denouncing Golitsyn. Not Šejna, I'm sorry. Ian Pacepa. Pacepa wrote a long piece in WorldNet Daily denouncing it, and I had an argument with him over that. He was kind of upset with me, but this is an important thing that they don't understand. You have these, and I'll tell you the evidence that that this is a very important deception is actually very it's contextual and it's difficult. But we know now, when we look out, Golitsyn had made these predictions in his 1984 book, New Lies for Old, which was from a 1982 manuscript. And he said the Sino-Soviet split is part of these experiments in fake splits. And that we know from other sources that Golitsyn had actually heard the head of the KGB refer to this as a plan in 1959, that they were going to carry out a fake split with China. So he'd heard that directly from the lips of the head of the KGB. And so Golitsyn had this as a hint to go on, and he studied it very carefully. It's in his book. And so he makes predictions about how this would be used. And so he says, look, they're going to use this to get the West to come in and build up China. They're going to get the West to think that it doesn't have as great a threat because China and Russia are against each other. And then at the end of this process of the false liberalization of Russia, and the West being disarmed by this and anti-communism going away, that Russia and China will then, at the end of the process, unite into what Golitsyn called one clenched fist.
Yeah.
Well, lo and behold, that's what we see today.
Exactly.
So Golitsyn's big prediction about the Russia-China split has come true now.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, I said this at the beginning of the show. The Americans had used a so-called offset strategy. We will outproduce the communists, we will live better, and eventually, they don't stand a chance against us. But then when the phony split happened and, Russia publicly abandoned communism, this is when it gets really problematic, because then, especially starting in the 70s with, the technology sales to China, from the West and all that, when the West was selling entire factories to China, this sort of messed up this American offset strategy, right? So because then the Chinese could build up their economy, and now China is this huge economy. And now China, as some observers have noted, now China is trying, with its international partners, China is trying its own version of an offset strategy. You just gain more allies. You cut off the Americans from their allies to have this overwhelming power at some point. This is what the fake split was. The fake split was meant for, and publicly abandoning communism. This made absolute sense. I mean, it's not a discussion about a fringe theory or some fringe scenario. This was the thing. And I have some.
They used Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin as one of the pretexts for an ideological dispute between Mao and Khrushchev. And then when Mao and Khrushchev had their face-to-face meeting in October 1959, supposedly the Chinese then were allowed to make some nasty comments about Khrushchev in the wake of the meeting. Allegedly, Mao had asked Khrushchev to build a big navy for China, and he basically refused. It was another point of contention because he wasn't really into having world revolutionary war. And Mao, of course, was posturing as the guy who wanted to go, why not have a nuclear war? We'd come out with more Chinese, right?
Yeah.
Kill 200 million Americans and 200 million Chinese, and we win.
Yeah, exactly. I have some quotes here, from selected quotes from Jan Shana. This is the Jan Shana, the Soviet defector. It's from his book, We Will Bury You. So he says the following: the first hint we had of the split was in 1958, after General Lomsky led an official visit of senior officers of our armed forces to Beijing. So he talks about the Czechs going to, the Czechs going to Beijing. The tour ended with an interview with Mao. The chairman made no mention at all of the Soviet Union, but using suitably Marxist phraseology, he affirmed it was China's responsibility to develop a new theory and practice of communism in Asia. So we can assume that Lomsky talked to other Czech. Lomsky then talked to other Czech communists about this trip, And this information found its way to Shana, who then defected. Shana defected 10 years later to the West and told what he had heard. So if Mao was deliberately spreading false information, then the expectation probably was that these falsehoods could leak to Western intelligence and policymakers. This would make it believable, because the CIA and others, they could say, well, this comes from a defector, and he, relates these stories from other people, so it must be credible, right? And so then there's another quote, and it says, Marshal Ivan Konev, commander-in-chief of the Warsaw Pact, cut short Lomsky's enthusiasm for Mao's collectives by snapping at him. My experience tells me we should never trust these Asian fanatics. Now, Konev was a marshal of the USSR and commanded troops in World War II. So this is sort of the theater that was going on, and apparently many communists even believed it themselves. And there's another one. In November 1960, the World Communist Conference of 81 parties took place, called by Khrushchev
in Bucharest, by the way, in Romania, they held it.
Called by Khrushchev to win approval of his policy of peaceful coexistence. And
this, by the way, this was the first meeting of all these parties since World War II. So it was a very big event.
And to affirm Moscow's hegemony over the communist movement, now challenged by China, the Russians discovered what underlay the Chinese attitude early in 1961, when their intelligence sources obtained copies of a secret letter circulated to party cadres in China. It blamed the Soviet Union for the disunity in the communist movement and accused the Russians of planning a military attack on China. So this is the information, or the pseudo fake phony information that was tossed around, and that was picked up by many communist officers, and some of this information found its way to the West, Western intelligence.
Yeah. And of course, the open polemics, of course, it's ironic that in that 1960 November to December meeting, it was Deng Xiaoping that was representing the Chinese delegation. The Deng Xiaoping famously accused of being a revisionist by Mao. So they were all posturing. And one of the things that we learned from studying Stalin and Mao is that they would tack to the left and they would tack to the right. And they were always doing this. And Gorbachev referred to this as the Leninism follows a zigzag course, right? You're zigging to the left, you're zagging to the right. And of course, Stalin, when he went to the right in the 1920s, he eliminated his left-wing party members. Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Trotsky got pushed out. And then when he tacked back left with the end of NEP, he got rid of Bukharin, right? So this is the thing, is that these other people had to go left when Stalin went left and go right. But what they learned was, by playing this game between Mao and Khrushchev, they could actually create the illusion of a split. And it's really ironic that in this split, China claimed that it wanted World War III and Russia didn't. So Russia wasn't revolutionary, but China was in no position to wage World War III in the 1960s. It's absurd.
It's really ridiculous.
By 1963, you begin to have open polemics in the Russian and the Chinese press, each against the other country, like this booklet that I have here, which is, the Soviet Union under the new czars. That's typical of the thing you would read. But, American analysts were very skeptical, and you had this Golitsyn who had come to the CIA and said, look, they're going to do this fake split. So Angleton, the head of CIA counterintelligence, was looking very much for evidence, for the proof, for the smoking gun that they were collaborating. Of course, all he could find were things like what Nevin found in his book here, all the different projects. And of course, one of the things is there was the alleged withdrawal of the Soviet nuclear specialists to help China develop nuclear power and nuclear bomb.
But then they sent German communist specialists to China.
And by the way, one of the things Nevin's discovered, if I'm remembering right, is that a lot of these, not all of these Russian nuclear specialists were withdrawn.
Yeah.
There was a continued help by Moscow so that in 1964, Communist China got the bomb. Well, if Russia had withdrawn its support, how did they get the bomb?
Oh, by the way, didn't the famous or infamous atomic spy Klaus Fuchs, he was arrested in when he was back in Britain. You know, he spied in America against the Manhattan Project. Mm-hmm. The British had told the Americans, this guy is safe. We vetted him multiple times. He's safe. Of course, he spied on the Manhattan Project. Then he went back to Britain, and he was ultimately arrested in Britain. And they put him to prison for a couple of years. But then they released him, didn't they? And they sent him to communist communist Germany, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah, and he continued his work, right? And you know, some German guys, I think, were even sent then to China to help them.
We were always exchanging people with the Eastern Bloc, and of course, it's funny how these different countries. One of the things that Nevin shows is how these different countries that were strictly under the thumb of the Soviet Union were going and helping China. So how could that be when Russia and China are denouncing each other? Then you have the interesting thing. So how do they sell this to? They don't really try to sell this to Kennedy or Johnson, but they end up really selling this to Nixon with Kissinger at his elbow, with Henry Kissinger being Nixon's national security advisor. And of course, Kissinger is famously a disciple of Metternich's idea of a concert of powers and a balance of power and making peace for the next generation. And Nixon had these visions. When you look at Nixon's first inaugural address in January 1969, he's talking a lot about peace. He's talking, of course, the Vietnam War is going on. He wants to bring it to an end. And so this is a very interesting, and of course, we've had this peace movement in the United States, and Nixon is sort of responding to that. And famously, Nixon, slipped away from his secret security detail. I think he was only a couple of months in the White House, and there were all these demonstrators at the Lincoln Memorial. And here Nixon by himself goes in amongst these demonstrators and spends all night talking to them. Yeah. Right. So the president of the United States, without any bodyguards, is going out mixing with the demonstrators. And of course, these kids must have been just astonished.
Yeah.
But he stayed up all night arguing with them. So this is Nixon is really into this peace thing. And
I think the straw that broke the camel's back on this one, I think, was what we're going to talk about in just a bit. Was the Lin Biao incident. So this was supposedly this grand coup d'etat attempt, with the Chinese and so
with the Russians behind it, supposedly.
Yeah, and this created this finally cemented this false impression, because this phony split thing had been especially developed during the 1960s. The border troops, the Russians and the Chinese and the CIA
supposedly fighting each other.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I saw some old CIA memos that said, well, according to our sources, these border forces are 10 times smaller than what was said
claimed.
Or claimed.
Yeah.
And it's like this charade was taking place during the 60s, and then this Lin Biao incident happened, and this finally sold the lie apparently to Nixon. Because Kissinger obviously talked to Nixon about this, and probably told him, well, this is going out of control. This is, and we can use this. We can use this to our advantage. We're going to play nice with the Chinese, and we're just going to play off the Russians against the Chinese, and this will, ease the pressure on everybody. It's like,
let's go into the details. Now, I just as a personal remembrance, when I was 11 years old or so in 1969, there was a report on the radio one morning that they were hearing, maybe I was 12, it was somewhere in there, they were hearing, picking up Russian military communications about artillery strikes on the Chinese border and so on. So there's these reported border clashes between Russian and Chinese troops. And in 1969, now H.R. Haldeman was Nixon's chief of staff, and he wrote a book called The Ends of Power, which came out after he got out of jail for Watergate. I think it came out in 1978. I read it when it came out. And H.R. Haldeman, or 1977 rather, but anyway, H.R. Haldeman claimed that in 1969, the Soviet Union approached President Nixon and said, we want to do a preemptive nuclear strike on China against China's nuclear facilities. So China won't be a nuclear power. We want you to go in on this strike with us.
And of course, didn't the just to quickly interject here, didn't the Russians even didn't the Russians also talk to other governments worldwide to put out the feelers, supposedly? How would you react if there was a Russian-Chinese war?
It was a big
Could you
broadcast.
be on our side?
Yeah.
Could you be on our side theoretically? So this was selling the lie.
Yeah, they were really selling it, and this is really, and of course, it was sensational when Haldeman's book came out. This and the other revelations, and of course, Nixon firmly denounced this, said that the Soviet Union had better not nuke China, that he put bombers in the air, according to Haldeman, and threatened that we would use our nuclear umbrella to defend communist China. And of course, we had no real relationship with communist China. At about that time, it had been 2 years since we'd even had our diplomats meet with the Chinese diplomat at this point. We would occasionally have meetings, usually in an East Bloc, Warsaw Pact capital with some Chinese diplomats. Our diplomats would talk, and it was always about, you support Taiwan, so we don't want to talk with you. And that would be it. We'd meet every couple of years. But then in January 1970, after this supposed Russian threat to nuke China had passed, both the U.S. delegate to the meeting was held in Warsaw, which is, of course, an Eastern European country under Russia's control. The Chinese and American diplomats both said to each other, maybe we should have a more in-depth meeting. Maybe we need to get together.
Yeah.
And so this was the beginning of and of course, if you read Kissinger's memoirs, which are right here, and I reviewed it last night, his memoirs are titled White House Years. This is his first volume. Kissinger says this was sensational, that they were getting intelligence sources from everywhere, like you say, that Russia really hated China, that the Chinese really felt like they could be annihilated by the Soviet Union, and they needed to have Americans' friendship. And so this kind of plays out. But what's really interesting is as they're trying to work on these meetings and how to approach, the idea comes about of sending a presidential envoy to China, which of course is going to ultimately be Kissinger. This then in July of 1970, when they're 6 months into this process of starting to talk, there is an American signals intelligence plane 100 miles off the coast of China, and a Chinese MiG fighter pursues it and tries to shoot it down. And of course, this causes a great stir in Washington, and it's both in Nixon and Kissinger's memoirs, and it's interesting how they both talk about it. And it was like Kissinger comes up with the idea that there is an internal conflict in China, that the Chinese, that there's a faction in China that does not want the Americans to talk to Mao, and that faction must be pro-Moscow, right? I mean, that's the logical inference. If Russia and if China and the U.S. are getting together, and there's an incident where a Chinese plane tries to shoot down an American plane over international waters, this has to be an attempt to sabotage the relationship by somebody who's really with Moscow. So this then begins this strange story that becomes the conspiracy and death of Lin Biao, because then as the events occur, finally you have Kissinger end up going in July of 1971 to Beijing.
The secret trip. You mean the secret trip?
It's a secret trip to China.
He pretended to be ill, right? He faked an illness and
right, or he the Chinese joke that he pretended to have a secret liaison with one of his girlfriends,
Okay.
that kind of thing. But anyway, so he makes this secret trip. Nobody knows what's going on. But then so now when they got it in the bag, when the Chinese and the Russians have got it in a bag, and they've got this belief that there's a faction in China that's really with the Russians. In September of 1971, the U.S. intelligence notes that the Chinese leaders disappear for 5 days. And then there's this plane.
You said leaders, plural. Or singular.
Chinese leaders, yeah, all of them.
Yeah.
All the top leaders disappear for 5 days. And then there's this plane that leaves this military airfield and crashes in Mongolia, or maybe is shot down in Mongolia, right? And they're thinking, oh my gosh, what is this? What has happened here? And so we've got some intelligence that there has been a coup attempt against Mao, that Lin Biao, the head of the People's Liberation Army, and one of the three leaders of the Cultural Revolution, which is Madame Mao, and Lin Biao, that he is dead, that he tried to overthrow Mao in collusion with the Soviet Union. That's why he fled to Mongolia on his plane. And of course, we have this story, but it doesn't quite add up.
Yeah, and it's like people have to remember it was the forensic investigation conducted by the USSR which recovered the supposed bodies following the crash. So the Soviet Union had confirmed that, or claimed that Lin was among those who died in the crash. So we have to rely on their word.
The Soviet Union, in reality, Lin's body wasn't on the plane. Actually, my source, Colonel Lunev, didn't say whether Lin was on the plane. What he said is that all the bodies had been murdered before they were put on the plane, and the pilot had crashed the plane in Mongolia and had parachuted out, and was picked up on the Mongolian border and brought back to Beijing. So the whole incident was a fabrication. Now, what's interesting is that that you have this book, which comes out, and it's rather, the Washington Post review of it denounced it, as did many, denounced it as disinformation. It's The Conspiracy and Death of Lin Biao by Yao Ming Li. And this is a very interesting book because it has things in it that are right out of Golitsyn, but they are given an explanation that helps support the Sino-Soviet split. So you have this story that they're trying to sell to the Americans, that Russia and China are at war, that Lin Biao, at the behest, working secretly with the Russians, tried to destroy Mao, which then explains the attempt to shoot down the airplane, right? And of course, the U.S. intelligence aircraft. But what this Conspiracy and Death of Lin Biao says is really interesting. Remember, we talked about there's something phony about the border incidents between the Chinese and Russian troops.
Oh yeah, there was just so people know and are aware of this. There were some. Well, there are claims of skirmishes along the border. Some people get shot on this side, some people get shot on the other side. So we have to rely mostly on communist sources. We're supposed to trust these sources.
There's American signals intelligence that Russians are directing artillery fire. They're picking up the communications for directing artillery fire on the border. And of course, there's the fabrication that there's more troops on the border on both sides than there really are.
10 times more, yeah.
Yeah, and so we've got this intelligence. So now it could be that this incident of trying to shoot down the plane was that we had a spy somewhere in the People's Liberation Army feeding back to us, hey, this border incident is phony as a $2 bill. So what Yao Ming Li says is, yeah, there were phony border incidences. Lin Biao was arranging them because of the Jade Mountain plan. See, his plan to overthrow Mao. Now, there was supposedly, according to Yao Ming Li, there was an attempt to ambush Mao's armored train with a rocket attack. And they bungled it. It didn't work. But this Jade Mountain plan was that you have a phony war, that Lin Biao is secretly working with the Soviet generals in Moscow to create a phony war between China and Russia and the Soviet Union, so that Mao will be forced into his secret bunker where Lin Biao has prepared gas to gas Mao when he's in the bunker and kill him, and then take power. Now, there's another, of course, Lin Biao's son, Lin Lin, I think it's Guo is his name, was supposedly party to this plot, and of course did some bungling supposedly. But Mao finds out about the plot, has Lin Biao for dinner, and then ambushes his car as he's leaving Mao's compound.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so Lin Biao was actually killed, according to Yao Mingli. He's killed in the rocket attack, but it's his son and the other conspirators that flee in the jet and get shot down over Mongolia.
Yeah, and it says
and of course, yeah, but you see, since the Soviets know it's a fake crash, the Soviets are in a position to say, hey, we didn't try to overthrow Mao. This is all fabricated. No, the Soviets remained silent, said nothing about it. And of course, Colonel Lunev knew one of the people involved in examining the crash and the bodies. And so they knew, but they kept silent. Why? Because evidently Russia wanted the rest of the world to believe that they had attempted to overthrow Mao. They weren't going to contradict the story.
Yeah, and the original documents were destroyed. The records were destroyed, and so just how are we supposed to? How are we expected to verify this nonsense? If there's nothing, no photos, this, no that.
Kissinger says something in his memoirs which is really curious. Here, this major event takes place in China. It's of crucial importance of verifying whether this split is real or not. This is conspiracy and death of Lin Biao. And we've got, according to things I've read, there's like 4 or 5 different versions of this story. It keeps changing, right? Because when you see a story that's obviously not true, you then try to alter it to make it more believable to the people that aren't buying it, right?
Yeah,
so you keep altering it.
Yeah, and it seems like Lin Biao was he's been doing theater for a long time, and so this created sort of chatter, and some of this chatter leaked to the West. And when that supposed coup attempt happened, the Western intelligence, intelligence services, they tried to assemble reports. They were going through all the old documents and old reports, and it created sort of this giant picture of this looks kind of real, but it was 10 years of theater. I have another quote here. This is also from Jan Šejna's book, Soviet Defector, from the Czechs, and he was just telling what he heard, and he heard or saw, or somebody else saw. So here's the quote. It says until the Sino-Soviet split, the Chinese had observer status in the Warsaw Pact and enjoyed a comprehensive exchange of military and general intelligence information with us, meaning the Czechs. But by 1960, it was clear that this could not last. That year, I recall, the Chinese representative at the political consultative meeting of the pact in Moscow was Marshal Lin Biao. When Khrushchev made a speech analyzing the international situation and the objectives and prospects of peaceful coexistence, Lin Biao interrupted several times, leaping to his feet, banging his fist on his desk, and denouncing the policy. So this information, this was then this observation was then told by Jan Šejna to Western intelligence. So this ended up in the reports.
Now, let's talk a little bit about Lin Biao's character to show how out of character this is, and why this whole story of Lin Biao leading a coup against Mao doesn't make sense. Lin Biao was known as the Chinese communist general who never lost a battle. Well, how did he do this? Well, he made sure that he wasn't sent to Korea in 1950. He begged off of that. He made sure that he only accepted commands at places where he could get an easy win. So this is how Lin Biao got his reputation. He was very cautious and careful of what he chose. And Lin Biao was such a toady of Mao that he ended up being the closest of the major leaders in China to Mao. So that when the Cultural Revolution happened, the three leaders of the Cultural Revolution were Mao, Madame Mao, and Lin Biao. Lin Biao was out there in the demonstrations leading it. And of course, I should mention that the Cultural Revolution was actually the beginning of the liberalization of Chinese agriculture. Because one of the institutions that was destroyed during the Cultural Revolution was the Soviet collective farm collective system was basically dismantled because one of the things they did is they persecuted the Soviet trained local administrators over farm collectivization, which effectively removed the market controls on the sale of grain. A lot of people don't realize that happened during the Cultural Revolution, and that had to have been intentional on the part of Mao and Lin Biao. And of course, they did it because they had to find a way to loosen the economy in food production in a way that would, and then they could, so this was part of the beginning of their anticipating help from the United States and being able to loosen the economy. And there was, in a way, they were intensifying the ideological indoctrination of the youth while they were removing the strict communist bureaucratic control of the economy.
Yeah, and you can tell that over time, more and more people in, more and more people, officials in the communist countries, more people were kept out of the loop to protect the theater. I have another quote here from Shayna's book. It says this: Soviet economic and technical advisors were the first to leave China in 1959. The last of a total of 12,000 military experts were all out by the end of 1960. Now, you don't have to trust these numbers, obviously.
Yeah, obviously.
In 1963, the Czech military and foreign intelligence services, get this, sent their first agents to spy in Beijing. Hitherto, we had only posted liaison officers there, and this significant development placed China on the same level as our capitalist opponents. Now, people need to understand this. They were making, they were creating more and more barriers inside the communist states, so people couldn't get to the truth. So now the Czechs were out of the loop. They couldn't get, the Czechs couldn't get more inside information about what's happening in China. No more liaison people. Now the Czechs had to send spies to Beijing, hoping to get some information. It's ridiculous. I mean, this is how they played it, and they convinced people that that this is all real, and you're not supposed to.
Yeah, there's one other thing about Lin Biao that people need to know, is that at the time of the alleged conspiracy of Lin Biao to overthrow Mao in collusion with Moscow, Lin Biao was a sick man, and he was an old man. And generally, the people who are sick, who are physically ill and very old, don't lead coups, and they don't do it if they're cautious, like Lin Biao was, a very cautious man. So it doesn't, in terms of character, it doesn't make sense. And then a note about Liu Shaoqi. In the Cultural Revolution, the great enemy of that was denounced was the then head of the Communist Party, Liu Shaoqi, who and what's really funny about Liu Shaoqi is that nobody really knows what happened to him. Supposedly he was persecuted to death, hounded to his death. There's different stories, none of them fully consistent, about what happened to Liu Shaoqi. But I happen to know a Russian who, Liu Shaoqi's had a granddaughter in Moscow, because one of his children went to train in the Soviet Union and ended up marrying an American. I believe it was his daughter went there. She married a Russian, I think, Air Force officer. So this guy was dating the daughter when the KGB threatened him and said, we're sending him back. And this is around 1980 or so. we're sending her back to China to her family. Now, this is the granddaughter of Liu Shaoqi. Why is the Soviet Union sending the granddaughter of Liu Shaoqi back to China in around 1980 if there isn't some kind of secret cooperation? And of course, again, I point to Nevin Gusak's many finds about secret levels of cooperation that were hidden below the surface.
Yeah, and like there was no motive for Lin Biao to make a coup. There was no giant pressure to do this, and just it's because the story seems like there was this giant pressure and they had to act, and this was the one big chance. This is all nonsense. And also because why would they do this for some small ideological differences? Why would they do this because some Chinese wanted to, maybe introduce some more nationalist elements? Who cared? This was just normal. And also, the whole Soviet way of doing things, since the revolution in Russia, the Soviet way of doing things was to ensure by purges and more purges and by spying on your own people to ensure that there would never be a real break.
Right.
They've done this over and over again. And you saw lots of purges in the, China in the era of Mao. There was another purge. And then Mao said publicly, our comrades have become too complacent. They're not warriors anymore. They're not, hardcore enough. We need a purge. We need the hardcore guys. So there were purges in China, and probably these purges had multiple functions, and probably there were some people purged in China because they were not loyal to Moscow.
Well,
right?
someone who is really close to Mao was the head of the secret police. Then was Kang Cheng, who is a very
intelligence officer.
Oh yes, and he was quite the spider, Kang Cheng. And of course, what were Kang Cheng's history with Moscow? Well, he had always been Moscow's friend.
He was Beria's guy, right? I think Beria was connected to him.
Yeah, he came up through that era, and they were very close, these people, to the Soviets. I mean, you got to remember the Soviets carried these people and supported them during the period of World War II. And then they made sure these people got into power in China.
Yeah, because people have to remember this whole operation, right, of turning this giant country, China, into a communist system. This whole project, that was a huge investment by the Russians.
Communist China was Soviet Union's baby.
Yeah, and this was a huge investment. So what do? You protect your investment. You make sure you make sure that it doesn't wander off or that it turns into something else. And it's like
the idea that China was a threat to Russia, that China's nuclear arsenal was a threat to Russia, is laughable. I mean, it is even laughable now, given the differences in technological acumen of Russian rockets and Chinese rockets and Russian tech. And the Russians, by the way, it was the Chris Cox of the Cox Committee that was investigating Chinagate. That's the Clintons leaking technology through the Treasury Department to the Chinese. That investigation, one of the things in his Senate testimony, Chris Cox, a member of Congress, told the senators, he said the biggest surprise that we found was that Russia is working with China on its nuclear missiles. Yeah. And it's giving massive aid to China in developing its nuclear missile forces. That was in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yeah. What was this?
There may be another element to this fake split. This is something I've been working on, and I will explain this in detail at some later stage. I just like to briefly mention it. So this is something that looks like something that I stumbled upon, really, and this is probably another version of the another version of Operation Trust. Now, the original Operation Trust was in Russia. This was a fake anti-communist organizations, and this sort of worked like a magnet. It was attracting all these white Russian guys, and so they could be caught. And then, of course, there were more iterations of trust internationally, infiltrating the international anti-communist movement and so on and so forth. And I stumbled on probably another trust operation, and this claimed, I suspect, this further Operation Trust created the impression of a significant underground movement in Russia, Soviet Russia. So this was supposedly a secret white movement, Christian conservative, and this, supposed underground movement in Russia. This movement supposedly was working to destroy communism from within. And they were probably networking with, Western conservatives during the Cold War, creating this impression, hey, there's some really interesting, cool thing going on in Soviet Russia. This underground movement, they're working to destroy, communism and all that. And so by using an angle like this, fooling Western conservatives, this could also help sell the fake split between Russia and China, because then you would have the impression, maybe, communism will collapse in Russia and the Chinese hate that and all of that. And also,
by the way, the same thing is, I should interject that all the diasporas from the different communist countries, from Cuba, from Hungary, from, the Soviet Union, and from China, there's large numbers of people from those countries that went abroad, that escaped from communism. But those are the magnets for communist penetration. They want to penetrate these diaspora movements and organizations above all. And because they are members of their own country and they want to go home eventually, they seed them with this promise, this hope that, Putin might come and say, I'm really a Christian, to some white Russian of the diaspora in Germany. And then all of a sudden, they believe that that Russia's being taken over by a secret Christian movement. Exactly. Or like with Falun Gong, the Chinese intelligence service can penetrate that and then seed them with agents and so on. Any organization that leaves a communist country and sets up shop in the US or Britain or Germany is suspect, just because it's always the number one target for infiltration.
Yeah, and if there was this further Operation Trust about this supposed, supposed Christian conservative underground in Russia, if that operation was in place, and I just stumbled upon this, today actually, I was working on some angles, and then I found something that's really significant. If there was this deception about a fake underground movement in Russia, this deception would be perfect. This deception would be perfect to discredit the defector Golitsyn, discredit Angleton, discredit the idea of a monster plot, discredit the idea of, a phony end of communism in the future. All this
because all these people want to believe in a real end of it, and they believe they've touched the golden reality that communism is really coming to an end.
So you have guys like Angleton, and you have others at the CIA, counterintelligence. You have Bagley, you have all these guys, and then you have defectors like Golitsyn and others. And so these guys are talking to the president of the United States. They're talking to everybody, and they're saying, or talking to very specific people, who have access to this kind of stuff. And they tell these people, there's a monster plot. We are much more infiltrated than we thought. And we have a defector talking about a fake split between the Russians and the Chinese, and also one of our defectors and others, they're saying there will be a phony end of communism in the future. So we have all these guys, and we have all these. There's all this massive danger that we are falling for this deception by the communists, and this is really dangerous. So you had those voices, but then you probably had these other voices in the West who were falling for this new Operation Trust about a Russian, Russian secret underground, and this sounded so nice and great, what these other people were saying, that we have allies in Soviet Russia, and if communism falls, if communism comes to an end in Russia, it will not be a phony end of communism. It will be a real end, aided by this Russian underground.
Yeah.
This is something
and of course, look what we've done. Look what it's won for them. They get all these friends in the West who are anti-communists, who ought to be against them. And then they get together with other agents and their other friends. And then they get they're allowed to have access to technology. They get money. They get loans from the IMF. They end up getting, in terms of China gets massive investment and is built into an economic superpower, the largest number of factories in the world. The country with the most industrial capacity, China. Yeah.
And now people in the West, especially conservatives, Republicans and all that, conservatives in the West, they bought this phony end of this phony end of communism in Russia and the USSR. They bought that, and they now believe, and you can see this all over the news and the web and everything, these Western conservatives, they think that Putin is their guy. He really ended the last remnants of communism, and some people, and there's some suggestions that had been spread around a long time ago. Some people actually believe, powerful people, connected people in the West, they actually believe that people like Putin and people like Sobchak, the mayor of St. Petersburg, who was close to Putin, they believe that these two guys and others had been part of that secret underground, that Christian conservative underground in Russia. Mm-hmm. So they want to thank Putin. They're not saying it out loud that much. They don't want to be too explicit about it, but they think that they have to thank Putin for destroying communism, along with destroying it with the help of this underground. Just to give a real quick short preview. A couple of years ago, I read the book by Catherine Belton. It's called Putin's People in English, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I have the German edition, I have the English edition. So
I read this very interesting book. Yeah.
Very interesting book. So I read this whole thing, and then I noticed this one thing that I didn't expect. I was expecting all this great inside info of Russian money flowing into the city of London and all this appeasement and all this craziness. So I was expecting that. But then she tells a story, Catherine Belton does. She says that one of her sources, high-placed person, banking industry, that source told her the following. The source says, well, there is this, now was, because she's now dead, there was this Russian princess. She's called Princess Tatiana Hilarionovna, and she's also related, or she comes from the Vasilchikov family, an old established Russian Tsar, pro-Tsar family. And Princess Tatiana Princess Tatiana had lived in Hessen, Germany, meaning the West. So, not the communist part of Germany. She lived in this castle in Hessen, and she had married Paul from the Metternich clan. this very old Austrian, partially German family. Metternich. And you mentioned before Clemens, I think it was Clemens Wenzel von Metternich, the famous international, statesman.
The nemesis of Napoleon, yes.
Exactly. And so, this was Princess Tatiana. She had grown up in, the old Russia, and her family was then evacuated first to Crimea, and then the British king, actually, I think it was George V, the British king has them picked up, and also somebody from the Romanov family. So Tatiana's family was very old, and Tatiana's family was close to the Romanovs. So they get evacuated from Crimea, and she ends up in this castle in Hessen. And then we are told in this Catherine Belton book, we are told that the source explains that Tatiana, in her castle in Hessen, she got a visitor, and that visitor was none other than Vladimir Putin, a younger Vladimir Putin. Now we know that
this would be what, around 1985, 86?
Five-ish. As it was either 85. It was either 85 to 89, because that's what the foreign posting was.
And that's when of course Putin was working in the Dresden KGB in liaison with the Stasi.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So people have to remember the German border. That was, Hessen is right next to the Soviet German state. So it would have been as simple for Putin. It would have been very simple. Get into a car, drive up to the German border, then sneak over the border, and with false papers and everything, make your way to that castle in Hessen to talk to Tatiana von Metternich.
And what on earth would a KGB man like Lieutenant Colonel Putin have to talk to a Russian princess about?
So
what would he be talking to her about?
So this was either the height of the Cold War in the 80s, or maybe it was earlier. I mean, the foreign posting of Putin started in 85, but he was in training and other things before that. So it's not given in the book by Belton what year it was, but. So Putin,
and of course Putin is a fluent German speaker, as we know. Famously.
Exactly, his German is pretty good. I mean, he spoke German in a speech at the Bundestag in the parliament in, I think, the year 2000. So he can have false papers, everything. He drives to the German border, hops over the border, meets up with this Russian born Princess Tatiana, who married into the Metternich clan. Okay. What would they talk about? Now, the first thing you have to remember is Princess Tatiana was one of the most connected people you can imagine. She was not just connected to exiled Russians, the émigrés. She was deeply connected to German aristocrats. She was deeply connected to the British aristocracy, actually the British throne. She was connected to the ruling family of Denmark. She was connected to the Mountbattens, everything. We know about Lord Louis Mountbatten and how, close he was to the Soviet Union. And so Tatiana also knew these right-wing German guys and, politicians and industrialists, like the Oetker clan, right?
And she was pretty right-wing herself, wasn't she?
Well, she explains this in her books, and I read them today, and I was just amazed, right? So she explains it like this: she hated the Nazi leadership. She thought the Nazi leadership was a bunch of psychos and weirdos and dwarves and all that.
Pretty much.
But
Right.
yeah, that was a fitting description. But she liked many German conservatives, and she married one. She married one of them. Paul von Metternich, who was active in the military. And
it's by the way, the Metternichs are a family that have been very much Anglophiles. They love the British. They love the British traditions, political traditions, and were the chiefs of the conservative, people in Austria, and so that family has this tradition of conservatism.
There's an episode when right at the end, or right when World War II was over, Germany was collapsing, everything was in chaos, the Red Army was approaching, it was a total mess. Of course, Princess Tatiana, the Russian-born princess, and her husband, von Metternich, they had to escape to save territory. Now, the Russians were after them. Some of the Germans were after them because I think Paul was connected to the assassination plot against Hitler. And so Tatiana and Paul, they get help from the Americans. And the Americans tell them where to go, where to escape. And so they go from castle to castle because, of course, they have these connections, right? So eventually they make it to Bavaria, and they stay for a while at the castle of the House of Hohenlohe, right? So they're greeted by this aristocrat who was Paul's former commander, a short while back. So they're greeted by this aristocratic guy, the House of Hohenlohe, and this guy's wife. She is directly related to the to the highest levels of Britain. She's related to the Romanovs. She's related to the House of the House of Hessen and all that stuff. So they went from
tell
castle
us
to
what
castle.
what do you think Putin had to say to her? Why would Putin be talking to her, and what did you learn about her beliefs that might indicate what that was about?
So she not only made that distinction between the bad Nazis and the good German conservatives, she also made a similar distinction when it came to the Russians. So she said that the communist leadership was just terrible and horrible, and she hated the communist leadership. But she was convinced that Princess Tatiana was convinced there was this underground in Russia, and the secret underground in Russia. She explains this very thoroughly in her book. This was her memoirs, and there's other books. So she was convinced that the communists had not been able to really change the soul of Russia and the soul of the Russians, right?
Oh dear.
So they tried to destroy the Orthodox Church. They tried to re-educate people, blah, blah, blah. And you have to remember, a lot of the white Russian families, like herself, Tatiana, the Vasilchikov family, those were the white Russians.
And they were very often very religious, the women particularly, very religious.
And so in the Russian Civil War, a lot of these white Russians became red, the red Russians, communists, because they felt there was no other way. They didn't like communism, she explains, but these whites had to pretend to be communists. And a lot of these whites were not purged, in the later decades. These families, these originally white families, continued to exist. And so she alleges, and she may have believed it, she alleges there was this secret conservative Christian underground in Russia, right? So this is what she tells people.
And so where did she get this idea? Could she have gotten it from her visitor, Mr. Putin?
Well,
who's known to carry a cross and claim to be a Christian secretly?
Yeah, I mean, and there's another little thing I need to mention before I get into what Putin probably told her. Tatiana and her husband, they had, business activities. So, for example, they had a winery and they were cooperating with the I think it was the Henkel and Söhne, company, and they had a joint venture with the Oetker Group. These were billionaires. Eventually, the Oetkers became billionaires in Western Germany, and they made pudding mix and frozen pizzas and all that stuff, right? But there was a dark side to the Oetkers, of course, because the Oetker family, they had been one of the most privileged families in Nazi Germany. They made pudding mix for the German soldiers and I think also ammunition. So it was a pretty dark family. And so
so they're still making pudding though, right?
they make some nice pudding,
a political
pudding
pudding.
And nice pudding and nice frozen
Russia's
pizza.
being taken over by Christians. That's quite a pudding.
And so this Oetker guy that Princess Tatiana was working with, and I think the Oetkers eventually, owned Tatiana's champagne business or something. I mean, people remember the commercials on German television. This was on all the time. The Metternich champagne, or as we call it, sect, right? This was a popular product. Everybody could buy this Metternich branded,
Did Ribbentrop ever sell it?
No.
As he was a champagne salesman before he was a Nazi leader.
There were some more champagne salesmen in Germany, in Nazi Germany. And so this Oetker guy, he was entangled in this Oetker guy was entangled in a secret organization which was called Stille Hilfe. That means silent help. And this organization was smuggling high-ranking Nazis out of the country. I mean, some of the most famous names. They were smuggling them out of the country. And they were also helping more Nazis to get a lesser sentence for crimes, or to get them, acquitted of any crimes. And so this was a very dark organization that Mr. Oetker was involved in. And Oetker was not. They were
smuggling the Nazis to Argentina, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so Oetker,
and along with all the Nazis in Argentina under Soviet control, because of
And so Tatiana was tied to this industrialist, the pizza and pudding guy Oetker, and Oetker was also working for this secret organization. Oetker was also working with another princess from Hessen. Okay, so Tatiana believes, or pretends to believe, there was this secret underground in Russia, that it's always been there, that it's growing in Russia. These people are not really communists. They're white Russians.
We heard this before.
They love, this Operation Trust all over again. And these guys, they really like the old Russia and they want to bring back the old Russia. So this is what Tatiana either believed or pretended to believe. So then, with all her connections, you have to imagine these industrialists like Oetker, they were always donating money to politicians, conservative politicians. And there were more industrialists like this, and so this was tied to politics, right? So Tatiana was either, maybe Tatiana was infiltrating the right wing in Germany, Western Germany, or she was fooled by this fake underground. So then comes Putin, right? The secret visit,
Tatiana meets Volodya.
And so Putin gets, was probably already stationed in Dresden. He gets into his car, drives to the German border, gets over the border, and with false papers, he can speak German. He goes to this castle in Hessen, talks to Tatiana. Now, there has been rumors, or some significant rumors, that Putin himself may have had some aristocratic ancestors. Now, there was a clan called Putiatin, which was very old in Russia, and it was happily collaborating with the Romanovs. And so this back in those days, when there was an illegitimate child, then the last name of that illegitimate child was often shortened by a syllable. So Putiatin would become Putin. Now, none of this is really confirmed, so we don't know if Putin really has some aristocratic blood or if he just wanted to create this impression. But so when he visits Tatiana, Putin was really in the perfect position to sell that phony idea of a secret underground in Russia.
Especially now, maybe since Tatiana he likes to wear that cross and
maybe Tatiana was already
people,
Maybe Tatiana was already in on the scam. Maybe she was fooled by Putin, but this was probably Putin's approach while talking to her. Hey, listen, I am formally a communist. I've work for the KGB, but I really hate communism. I'm a Christian, and there's an underground in Russia. And I didn't tell my KGB colleagues that I would be making this visit. So you have to be cautious about who you tell about this visit. And so I'm trying to talk to you because of this underground in Russia, and you have all these connections, Princess Tatiana, so you could help us out. So we could get you information from inside Russia, and you could maybe get us some information flowing towards Russia. And also, as I said, Tatiana was connected to the Oetker family, and they were helping former Nazis. So if this whole Oetker operation was infiltrated by Soviet intelligence, this would be a nightmare. And this would actually explain why the conservative party the conservative party in Germany became more and more pro-Russia, especially after 1991, and especially when Putin came to power. Because why would this conservative party in Germany that was so pro-America all this time during the Cold War, why would this party push the career of Angela Merkel, who grew up in the East under communism? Why would they do that? This would explain a lot, why
Sure.
Why all of this happened. So and then, of course, when Putin became head of state, some people not only believed he was in the West, some people not only believed that Putin was, really a conservative and a Christian, but some people probably believed that Putin had been part of the secret underground working to destroy communism. So some people were probably thanking Putin for destroying communism. And so when you're talking about somebody like Tatiana von Metternich, she was connected to so many people in the West, and this is probably how this idea was spreading of that phony this idea was spreading about this Russian underground. And this
is where you get these idea of phony changes.
Yeah, and this is
in the Soviet Union and phony changes in other communist countries. We have these stories. There's a Cuban version of this. There's the Romanian version. There's the Chinese, of course. The people forget that the crackdown at Tiananmen Square began because there was a democracy movement in China, and people thought, oh, China's going to democratize.
Yeah, and this is maybe how this lie of a secret underground. This is probably how this lie spread, not just in Western Germany, but also in Britain, because Tatiana was so connected to Britain. And then this idea probably spread to the United States as well, because nowadays we see guys like General Flynn and many others, and they started to believe in Putin. They started to believe in this supposed change in Russia.
Yes.
This is, this would have been the perfect way of selling the lie and drowning out, the just completely or almost completely just drowning out the voices of the warnings of Golitsyn and Angleton and some of these others, because it was the perfect way to sell this, and imagine if this had reached Americans, influential Americans, right-wingers, conservatives, they probably heard this multiple times from influential people. So they thought this information was coming from all directions. So it's probably true.
Yeah, you have this enormous organization in the KGB and its sister services to spread all kinds of false news and images. And of course, this is what the Chinese did in terms of exaggerating in coordination with the Russians, this idea that there was this conflict between Russia and China. Yeah. And we're getting up on the the 2 hour mark, and I'm thinking we should probably. People say we go too long. I'm thinking, do you think we're at an end point here?
Maybe one other point, because I think that's very important. When in 1971. The lie was sold about the Russian-Chinese split. Kissinger talks Nixon into this, we should play nice with the Chinese, and that actually happened. So what happened next in the 70s, or starting in the 70s? These massive technology sales from the West, Europe, America, technology sales to China. Now, it's at the early stage, they said, well, we're just going to sell factories to make fertilizer, factories to make chemicals. Well, they can also be used for explosives, of course. And then at some point, the Chinese were demanding these Rolls-Royce engines, these airplane turbine engines, and this was prohibited by Western laws. But then Kissinger actually assured people that he found a way around it, that he could make this work. So all this technology was sold to the Chinese. And when we compare this to the current situation, people still don't get it. Republicans don't get it. They still think that Russia and China are really separate, and you could play them off against each other. This is still believed. We talk about this all the time when it comes to the Ukraine war. We argue that by supporting Ukraine, the Russians get weaker and weaker, so America can then focus on the Chinese threat, right? So by Russia getting weaker, this creates a problem for China. But many people don't buy that argument because they still think these countries over there, they're separate, and Putin is, anti-communist and all that nonsense. So this is how the West is fooled, and the Chinese have actually started a while ago. The Chinese have actually started their own offset strategy to hoping to outproduce the West to dominate. And it's like
and of course, if we don't see that Russia or China have become liberal democratic countries, it just hasn't happened. And yet we were sold this idea decades ago that these countries were going to change, and now we see they're united together, as Golitsyn warned. And they're dictatorial. They're more strict and dictatorial every day. China is cracking down. There's purges in China. Putin's cracking down. He's purging people there. And Russia's at war. It's invaded Ukraine. It's threatening nuclear war against Europe even now. And China's threatening war in the Pacific. I mean, we built these countries up ourselves by believing this nonsense that they were at each other's throats and that they were liberalizing and becoming good guys.
Now, of course, when this is my last point, or my last comment, when Russia started to fail in Ukraine, with the initial goals of taking over the country in a few days or a week or something, when it became a sort of a quagmire for the Russians, of course the Russians needed more help from China, and we've seen how that help has, increased. And so many people are now seeing, oh, wait a minute, they can act together, but there's still this opportunity for these Eastern countries. There's still the opportunity for them, and the opportunity will be there in a few years as well. This opportunity for, let's say, the Chinese or the Russians to make these the Russians can make these proposals to the West. Hey, give us Ukraine or a large part of Ukraine, and then we might not work together so much with the Chinese. How about that deal? Wouldn't it be a good deal? And the Chinese can do the same trick. The Chinese can talk to the West and say, well, if you let us have Taiwan and if you give us some other things, we will not support Russia too much. How about that deal? And this is all this nonsense.
It's just a version of good cop, bad cop,
Yeah,
that these two countries are playing. I mean, I don't know. To me, when I look deeply into the history and I follow the events, I go, that doesn't look real. That looks phony. But people believe what they want to believe without being critical, without reserving judgment. The mistake the West made is that we should have never trusted these people. They were criminals. They were the epigones of criminals. They were taught and mentored by mass murderers. And we're going to trust them to liberalize?
Yeah, and why would you buy something? Why would you buy a narrative, buy a story just because that story has a long background, a long history, right? Oh, this has been going on for 10 years. It must be true then, or it has been going on for 20, 30 years. It must be true. No, it does not. Because
no. In fact, it's been going on since the Trust, and we know the Trust was a fabrication. We know that Operation Win, and the invented Polish underground army was a fabrication. And again, they've pulled these tricks on us, and we've been fooled, and they still do it, and we're fooled.
And everybody knows, or at least should know, that this was a baseline technique even by the Nazis. You come up with a false idea, and you just repeat it endlessly from many different directions, so people believe it. I mean, this is how traditional conspiracy mythology works. So the czars, or from the direction of the czars came the fake protocols of Zion, and then more people got involved, and everybody was talking about it for a long time, and even decades before that. So eventually more people started to believe in in the existence of the elders of Zion, and their argument, when you criticize that and when you debate with these people, they always say, well, so much has been written about it. It must be true. There's so many different people wrote about it. Therefore, it must be true. No, it does not.
Yeah, it really stinks when you really start looking at it closely, and then you see what's happened since. It just hasn't. How are we in this horrible position where Russia and China have more nuclear weapons in the West, more modern nuclear weapons in the West, and have our artillery production's gone? We can't hardly sustain the front in Ukraine. What if there's a war in the Middle East with their allies in Iran? What if the war in Korea breaks out, and at the same time we've got China going at it? What happens to the West then?
Yeah, there's only a limited toolbox when you want to sell a lie. I mean, what can you do? You can maybe send over a fake defector, and that
all
defector
variations on the same theme.
So the defector will then give away some valuable assets to make the fake defector seem more credible. That's one option, but it's an expensive option because you have to give up some valuable sources, to sell it. But if you just create all this chatter and all this talk for a long time, that also works brilliantly, to sell the line.
It has worked. And so with that, next week we'll probably be going on to talking about the next phase in the Cold War, which is the post-Vietnam era and Reagan coming about. And so until next time, thanks for being with me. I'm Jeff Nyquist, and with me has been Alexander Benesch in Germany. And I hope that you will join us next week.